Welcome to the Divine Council Worldview Podcast. I'm Ron, and this is Mike. Good to have you along again. We are going to take an episode and continue Q&A today. We have questions being sent in all the time, and I do want to honor those questions with you all because, again, they always show me that someone's thinking ahead of me, in some sense, challenging something that really needs to be challenged at times. So thank you, everyone. If you have a question, again, send it to questions.dcwp@gmail.com. Before we jump in, I just want to do a shout out to Donnie and Cindy Clone. They are friends of mine, new friends of mine that I got last weekend. During the Memorial Day weekend, Susan and I visited their house church in Boyertown, Pennsylvania, and I had a good weekend of visiting with the folk there and going over really a lot of DCW things. Donnie was a long time a listener to Mike's podcasts and taking awakenings courses and things like that. And he contacted me and said, would there be a chance of getting together? And I said, you know what? You live a half hour from my wife's hometown. Let's make it happen. So that was last weekend. Had a great time. And if that ever works for someone to, if you need or would want a weekend, I would love to hear, where you live, and maybe you come my way or I come yours, whatever. We can make it happen because it's always a great benefit, I think, to folks who are interested in Divine Council things, and they're being taught by faithful pastors, faithful teachers, but there's just those questions that are welling up inside of a group of people, and that's what we tried to do this weekend, and it really was a fun time. All right, Mike, let's jump into our questions, and here we go. This is from Trent. Good question. I'm going to summarize it again. Let me just read what I have. In talking with an Eastern Orthodox Christian, I got the sense that his view of theosis was close to that of a Mormon, kind of a Latter-day Saint idea. What does a DCW have to say about theosis? By the way, the word theosis, again, you can see the word theos in there, and the idea of becoming divine is basically how we define that term. In the Western tradition, it's just divinization. Augustine even spoke of the divinization of mankind. So you could talk about divinization as well if you don't want to say theosis. But let's do it again. What does a DCW have to say about theosis that may differ or compare to both of these views? Now, for sake of time, I didn't feel the necessity to do a huge dive into Eastern Orthodoxy nor Latter-day Saintism, Mormonism. I have relatives in the Eastern Orthodox faith. I have a good friend who I got to know as a Mormon, and we had lengthy Bible studies together. He moved out of town a few years back, but before he did, we'd get together every month. I might have told you this story, Mike, and we'd have assigned readings for each of us, and we'd spend hours talking. And lovely man, firmly convinced of the Mormon faith, and I of the Christian faith. So neither of us converted each other, but we had fun comparing our views. What I think would be better to do, and this is kind of like learning the dollar bill so well that you know the counterfeit, is to be so familiar with the biblical argument that when you hear something coming from the Eastern Orthodox side that you may not agree with, or from the Mormon side that it makes sense. So let me just summarize what I would say. And we've talked about theosis as a pillar, really, of the Divine Council Worldview. In my mind, it's number 6 out of 6. If you go all the way back to our first episode, I give what are, in my mind, 6 pillars or ideas that firmly entrench one into a Divine Council worldview. Not that other traditions don't borrow from those 6, or that you are necessarily, because you have 3 of the 6, are a Divine Council worldview person. No, it's just that if you want to talk what is a Divine Council worldview, here are the 6. And number 6 is this idea of divinization. So let me quickly just run through what I would say are strong textual ideas for how we, or how I, and see how you would agree, Mike, would define theosis from a Divine Council worldview idea. Number one, salvation is about joining God's family, not merely escaping punishment. There is a change that happens to the person ontologically because of salvation. To me, that's part of the salvation story, that you're just not getting forgiven. It's not the metaphor, the symbol is being in a law court and the judge with a gavel says not guilty and off you go. No, that's not salvation. The ultimate goal of salvation is not forgiveness of sins, going to heaven, though that is true, but becoming full participants, in God's heavenly family. And so you get the family of Abraham, even the family of Jesus, or being in Christ, being a strong sense. So finishing this point, through Christ, humans are restored and elevated into the divine household in some sense. I believe that's where this is going, and that's how theosis means restored participation in God's cosmic administration and presence. So it's much deeper. That's my first point, that salvation itself is an ontological change within the person, somewhat experienced in this life and fully experienced in the next. Number two, humans are destined to replace or reclaim roles lost by rebellious Elohim. Now, that's a fascinating concept, and again, a lot to go through there, but let me read what I have. A recurring DCW idea, one that I believe is thoroughly textual, is that rebellious spiritual beings forfeited their authority through rebellion, and that someday, well, let me keep reading, the redeemed human family eventually inherits what corrupt divine beings lost. This is why passages talk about believers judging angeloi, ruling with Christ. This is in Revelation 2 and 3. Sitting on thrones or inheriting the nations. And that's why it's important thus that we're saved for much more of a cosmic vocation than just being forgiven people. Number 3 out of 5. Okay, theosis does not mean humans become God by nature. I think this is maybe where the Eastern Orthodox might lean from what I'm hearing. DCW categorically rejects the idea that humans become divine in an ontological sense equal to Yahweh. Remember, Yahweh is the only creator, as it were, or not as it were, but he is, and then you get into the through Christ question. But for now, he's the creator, as we'd say, and we are never going to become creators. So think of theosis as participation, not absorption. Humans never become uncreated, omnipotent objects of worship. So when we talk about divinization, we're not talking about becoming capital G God / Yahweh. We're talking about, again, we have to respect that word Elohim, the concept of divine beings, and that, yes, someday we will participate in some kind of life that equals that of a divine being. Number 4 out of 5, the Divine Council is ultimately expanded to include redeemed humanity. This is, again, one of those thoughts that seem to be consistent. One of the major trajectories of DCW thought is that the Heavenly Council, that word just means, again, assembly, but some kind of group, a host of beings that surround the throne of God, ultimately includes resurrected human beings. We have biblical scenes of heavenly enthronement, royal priesthood, shining, glorified saints, participation in divine governance, and again, many passages we can cite here. So I like the one in Luke 20:36. Jesus himself says you become equal to angeloi. And we have to, again, read that not as angels, which is the corrupted idea, medieval idea that we often come up with, but angeloi in the sense of divine beings. So even Jesus, on the words or on his lips come this idea that we become equal to a different class of being. And then my last point, and I'll let you jump in, Mike, and give any thoughts. Union with Christ in the Divine Council Worldview sense is the mechanism of human glorification. And anything I want to read here? Well, it's through Jesus, and nothing, again, that is totally new, but the idea that we do this because of resurrection, not just, like Lazarus was resuscitated in John 11. We're not talking that. We're talking about something where we participate in the resurrection of Jesus himself, thus 2 Peter 1:4, becoming partakers of, and here's that word theosis, partakers of the divine nature. So I can see 2 Peter 2:4 or 2 Peter 1:4 being the favorite verse of anyone who's trying to talk about theosis. I'm sure it's used by Eastern Orthodoxy as well as Mormonism, but it is the shocking verse of any. If you want to choose one verse that shocks the system, it is 2 Peter 1:4. Yep. I'll read my last sentence and then be done. It signals humanity's future incorporation into the divine realm as glorified imagers, however that's going to work, who dwell in God's presence, however that works, forever in bodies that have been changed into something they were not before. So I love, again, N.T. Wright's point that it's a signpost pointing into a dense fog. Whenever you talk about the afterlife, we don't really know how it's going to work. And your earlier point, last podcast about symbolism, I think is where we have to go, that when we become somehow glorified, deified, Elohimized, whatever you want to call that, we'll look down upon the bodies we have in the new heavens and new earth and say, wow, we had no idea. So, I mean, I'm there. I don't know how to define it. The feeling I did get from my Mormon friend was that he just used the word gods without the sense of Elohim or the Greek word theos. He just had us living on different planets as little gods, and I just felt he was repeating what he had been taught without really getting into good Hebrew and Greek. So, well, that's my case. So, any thoughts there?
Well, I think a few things, right? Whenever we're dealing with different camps, I think we have to ask the question, what do they mean by the word? Like, for example, in this case, theosis. This can be applied as well to words like salvation or redemption or even God or gods. Like, what do you mean by that? Because they come with a very different presumption, a pre-understanding that we oftentimes may just be assuming that they have the same definition that we're playing with, but it's not necessarily the case. And so this whole entire comparison between Eastern Orthodoxy's version of theosis and Mormonism, or just general Mormonism idea of theosis, they are coming from two very different places, right? Because within Mormon theology, it comes from this idea of essentially, the most devout, the ones who ultimately become theosized or elevated, that they themselves would become gods of their own worlds. Mm-hmm. And this is actually part of why within Mormon teaching there is this emphasis of family life, because the concept being that one day you will be another version of Adam and Eve, right, with your own children.
I've heard that
and
one.
Thus, and then thus have your own worlds, and you'll be gods over your own worlds. That's a very different thing from what we mean by theosis when we're coming from Eastern Orthodox thinking. And I wouldn't even just say it's Eastern Orthodox. I think it really is more of our evangelical Protestant unfamiliarity with the concept of theosis.
Right. I was never taught it in Bible college. I mean, I had good Bible teachers. I was never told about theosis ever.
So years ago, and I know this is a gross oversimplification, and I know that I might get skewed by friends who are Eastern Orthodox or folks who are very Reformed. But this is a gross oversimplification, but I use it sometimes to just convey the idea of why theosis is not terrible. And it's because theosis, the whole entire Reform idea of the steps of justification to sanctification to glorification is essentially theosis light. Because theosis as a whole concept within Eastern Orthodoxy, or even just more historical Christianity, I would say, because even technically the Roman Catholic Church has a version of this as well. They just don't talk about it as much.
Right. I would agree.
And that is essentially that the justification, sanctification, glorification process is not in steps from that kind of perspective. It's actually a whole entire spectrum. Okay. and that theosis is the thing that is occurring from our following, our loyalty to King Jesus, that we are all in the process and participating in his divine nature. Not just his divine nature, we're getting to participate in the very divine life of the Father, Son, and Spirit.
Yeah.
And over time, that slowly transforms you if you're actively engaging in this community, in this life with them. And so theosis, like as I've come around to understanding it more and more, that it's a pretty cool concept. It's a much simpler way and a better way to understand it, in that it's a spectrum, that it's not that you're justified and that's all I need. No. The point of being a follower of Jesus is that we are ever increasing in our sanctification, if we want to use that word, and eventually because we're heading towards glorification. But theosis captures all that within this whole entire conceptual framework.
Yeah. Paul makes the important point in 1 Corinthians 15, that if Christ has not resurrected, you are still in your sins. And I take that to mean, guys, remember the resurrection of Christ within which you participate, right? That's the salvation issue, is something that takes you out of the world of sin and death. And if you don't resurrect, you are never leaving that world of sin and death. Notice how that's much bigger than a penal substitution model. This is now talking change of ontological status in the mind of God. So that's why it's important.
And Ron, if I can also add, right, because I think sometimes, especially certain camps of evangelicals tend to view Eastern Orthodoxy with a lot of suspicion.
Mm-hmm.
Two things. I would highly recommend a resource that a friend who is Eastern Orthodox, but he was evangelical before. He had actually mentioned this book to me, and it is in my to read list. It came out in 2021. It's called The Evangelical Theology of the Orthodox Church, meaning Eastern Orthodox Church.
Okay.
So that probably be a good resource for folks who have a weird suspicion about it, but guys, it's not. Anyways,
I mentioned I went to an Eastern Orthodox church a couple of weeks ago. I forget the last time we talked. And so I have a friend who's a relative who's Eastern Orthodox, and he invited me. So my wife and I went, sat through a lengthy Eastern Orthodox service, and it was good to do it. Now, I did come away with questions, and I even, paused to say, what's this? What's that? Why this? Why that? And I appreciate your point that you can find evangelical parallels in almost everything they do, whether it be the symbolism that they present, or the Mass itself, or what do they call it, the Eucharist? I forget. But I did not participate because they did not want non-catechized people to participate. So I watched, but I did not participate. So I'm not going to get into it here for time, but it was good for me to see it and just understand in my questioning why things happened the way they did. Well, thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, can I mention just two more things? And this is just maybe resources for folks to dig a little bit even deeper if they want something that's more like a reference level, sort of resource. I would recommend Eastern Orthodox Christianity, the Essential Texts. It's a Yale University reference book.
Okay.
One quotation that I will read that comes from this, and actually another one, this is from Michael Gordon. It's in his book called Abide and Go, Missional Theosis in the Gospel of John.
Okay.
And so essentially combining these together, I would say Orthodox Christianity theology maintains the distinction between God and humanity. And God and humans become gods only in the sense of becoming like God in certain limited ways. Rather than absorption, participation better describes the reality, with human beings retaining their distinctive personhood in a relational union where persons of irreducible identity mutually indwell one another without losing your identity. Theosis in Eastern Christianity is understood as a process of salvation that looks forward toward a goal rather than backward at an accomplished fact. And it does not see a final end in this life. Perfect union with God cannot be achieved here.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's something that I would challenge my fellow evangelical brothers and sisters to. To me, I would want to glean all the wisdom that we can from our brothers and sisters throughout the entire historical church. And I do think that our Roman Catholic and our Eastern Orthodox or Oriental Orthodox or Church of the East, Persian church friends and brothers and sisters, that there is much that we have in common that we can learn from one another. I do like Gavin Ortland's this is a paraphrase of one of his books where he mentions that evangelicalism really should not be thought of as like a group or a movement, but as sort of this revitalization or revival within wherever it happens, right? Of people coming back to the text, of people coming back to a love of Jesus and the mission to go out and tell the world of this king that we follow. That it's meant to always be reviving those of us wherever we are, whether it's Roman Catholic, Protestant, Eastern Orthodox. That evangelical theology should not just be seen as a Protestant thing, but ultimately it's a renewal of the mission to share the good news of Jesus.
Yeah, good point. I did find that, let me make one comment about this, the service, the Eastern Orthodox service that I went to, and this is, since no one knows which one it was, I'm not going to tell anybody. Mm-hmm. The liturgy was said so fast that I don't think the priest or the father, I'm not sure what they call him, cared whether I heard him or not. He was so fast and so garbled at times. I think that if he had slowed down, the service would have been twice the length, and it already was over an hour and a half. It might have been said so fast because he had to get it all in. In which case, I walk away saying, well, you shouldn't do that, right? I mean, if it really means something to us, then say it slowly and meaningfully and don't hurry through it. And again, it's not a complaint. It was just an observation. It was like, well, I wonder why we hurried it if it was that important to the story of what Sunday morning is to represent. But that was just an interesting possibility or an interesting observation. But we do have to move on. Mm-hmm. Number 2, or our second question today, comes from Tim. Interesting question. Why a surge in exorcisms in the New Testament? Why was there such a very quick, well thought through question? Why was there such a large uptick in the casting out of demons and unclean spirits starting in the New Testament as compared to the Old? Now, we probably talked about this, along the way over our time together, Mike. So this is simply summation. You can respond as you'd like, but I'm just summarizing a lot of things that I know I've said or written over the years. Number 1, the gods of the Old Testament were already governing the nations they had been allotted. In other words, when you go through the Old Testament, just realize this, folks, you are living through a story that is meant to be the way it is, and that God, beginning with Deuteronomy 32 or Psalm 82, or really after Babel, Genesis 10 and 11, the nations were placed under the administration of lesser Elohim, while Yahweh kept Israel as his own inheritance. This does not mean, there's difference of opinion within the DCW, that they were morally good or ultimately faithful, but it does mean that their activity in that period of the Old Testament was in some sense expected and tolerated within God's providential arrangement of the nations. So that's why you don't have exorcisms. In my opinion, it starts with everyone's, quote, doing their job. And so if a demon, and I'll argue, again, there's difference of opinion here, but if an unclean being is doing his thing in the Old Testament, in one sense, he's supposed to be. That's what he's been allotted to do. So the very last sentence here, the spiritual geography of the world had not yet been fundamentally challenged, and they are living out their authority where they're supposed to be. So, number 2, now you can see where this is going. The arrival of Jesus changed the cosmic situation entirely. That's what one of the greatest benefits of a DCW is. Now you make sense of the change between Old and New Testament when it comes to demons and unclean spirits and the gods of the Old Testament. In my mind, you see it face front when Jesus is being challenged by these beings. So let me read this. A unique feature distinguishing the new from the old is not merely a heightened interest in demons. No, it's the arrival of Yahweh's Son into enemy-held territory. So what you're hearing is what you would have expected had you known what's going on. Daniel 7's prophecy of the Son of Man was simply coming true. The ministry of Jesus thus presents an invasion of the kingdoms of the gods. The Gospels repeatedly portray demons crying out in panic, and I think this happens, in fact, Mark 3:11 says it happens whenever they meet him. They bow down. Have you come to destroy us, just as we would have expected from prophecies such as Jeremiah 10:10, where it does say that they will be destroyed. So, the surge in exorcisms is not random, but signals that the kingdom of God is confronting the rulers and powers directly. And a DCW really helps make sense of that. Number 3, the New Testament portrays the gods as intensely interested observers. Besides the confrontations, you also have an interesting passage in 1 Timothy 3:16, seen by angeloi. So you have he who came in the flesh was vindicated by the Spirit. I forget all 6, but one of them is seen by angeloi, which, again, don't think angel, think divine beings. It's one of the 6 most important parts of this story of Jesus. He was seen by angeloi. While angeloi can certainly include loyal heavenly messengers, the phrase may also imply that all the heavenly powers, both faithful and rebellious, were observing the incarnation, ministry, death, resurrection, and exaltation. In other words, the gods of the Old Testament were watching these events unfold. And that becomes then one of Paul's great themes. I'll hurry on to number 4 and then get your opinion. The New Testament surge in exorcism signals the reclamation of the nations. And here's again where Dr. Heiser did a great job in seeing the big picture that I'd recommend. And it's almost impossible to miss. Now that you see it, you can't unsee it. The DCW sees Pentecost and the Great Commission as the reversal of Genesis 10. The Old Testament world largely operated under a division of nations, but the New Testament announces the reintegration of those nations under its rightful ruler. So I'll just summarize it that way. Why the uptick in New Testament exorcisms? Because it's the story. It just fits perfectly. You have gods doing their thing, their appointed role, as it were, in the Old Testament. They may even have been rebellious in doing it, and many, according to Psalm 82, were. But the point is that God had appointed that situation. But now in the New Testament, it's like, I've told you the story, one of the restaurants I cleaned when I was in seminary, 5 a.m., I had a cleaning job in rural Pennsylvania, and I would come into one of these beautiful restaurants. In fact, it was the restaurant that I had my first date with my wife back in 1985. And nice, sharp restaurant, but you walk into the kitchen at 5 a.m, turn on the lights, and all the cockroaches scatter. It was a terrible sight. And why? Because the light had turned on. And I always get that picture when Jesus comes in Matthew 4, when he meets the devil in the wilderness. The cockroaches are scattering, and it's because the light has arrived. So that's a good question, and that's my answer. Any thoughts, Mike?
So actually, can I share? I want to share a little bit of a snippet of a recent book that I saw at the last ETS SBL conference.
You mean stop sharing on my side?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Be happy to.
And just show a little snippet of this. This came out this past year in 2025. Let me share here. The book is called Early Judaism and the New Testament, Troubling Misunderstandings. And it actually is. There's a section in the book where the writers here, this is from Baker and a Baker academic, and this is actually talking about like what is going on with all the demons that appear in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. And, folks can kind of, if they want, they can pause and just take a read through what is highlighted here. But essentially what he's bringing up is there's, another possibility is that this kind of uptick seems to be part of a pattern when there is a large invading force of one nation into another. And so, for example, the writers mentioned here, studies of instances of demonic possession and exorcisms in particular societies have shown that demonic activity often occurs in distinct historical, societal, political, and economic contexts. Studies have particularly drawn attention to situations marked by insertions of imperial power. Demonic activity is common in contexts of invasive colonizing powers. And so it is interesting is that at the whole entire time of Jesus being on the scene, everything I think what you mentioned, Ron, is also applicable. But it is also interesting that like this is also happening at the same time while Rome is at its height. It is at its like greatest amount of power. Yeah. It is invading multiple lands and essentially just you're going from one land to another. So one territory to another territory. And then that territory is being conquered essentially by the people of Rome who serve supposedly a pantheon of a particular set of gods.
Yeah.
And so you got a lot of rivalry that is starting to happen, a lot of mixing of and interactions of different thoughts and different religions and different. And if we think that divine beings are real in the sense that they actually are not just figurative, but that there is something behind that, then it is interesting to think of one particular group or ethnicity of people who are under the rulership of a particular set of gods going into other lands. How would the gods of those lands feel about this all? Yeah. Well said. And so anyways, that's just another idea to throw into the mix of what is going on during the New Testament time.
The name of the book again?
It is called Early Judaism and the New Testament, Troubling Misunderstandings. It is from Baker Academic. Primary writer is Warren Carter.
Oh, Carter. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And
he does a lot of Roman Empire stuff. So he's good.
Yeah. So this was something I saw during the bookstores at ETS and SBL. I was like, oh, this is
buy everything you can. I was talking to that friend I mentioned at the beginning, Donnie, and we were kind of joking. I was joking with him, and he knew the point that when it comes to recommending books, just read them all. How can I recommend a book when I know that there's 5 others that you need to read besides the one I just said? But yeah, it's tough.
Yeah, I just thought that was really neat and very applicable for that question.
Yep, very good. So I think we've surrounded it and we've talked about it before, but I love the question, and I just think a DCW does the best job of any worldview as answering the question why an uptick in exorcisms. Again, I was taught Bible college, seminary, good places. I do not decry my education at all. But we never talked about the purpose of exorcisms, why the uptick, or why the surge. There is one when you come to a DCW mindset. Next question, 3 out of 4 that we're doing today again. Number 3, Holly asks, were the Pharisees not Yahwists? I'm going to summarize again her question. You have said several times in our John study that the Pharisees, and by that I mean, by the way, just to clarify for Holly's sake what I meant, I'm dealing not with just Pharisees in general, but the enemies of Jesus, Pharisees, because you have some good Pharisees like a John or a Nicodemus, of course, but when it comes to the enemies of Jesus is where I'm going to take this question. You've said several times that the Pharisees were non-Yahwists according to John's gospel. Does this mean they were actually worshiping other gods, like going to other temples, literally, right? Or was their thinking about Yahweh incorrect? And then she said in her question, we all have bad theology somewhere, so it just seems that we got to be careful when it comes to being incorrect about Yahweh. How incorrect do you have to be before you are found not worshiping him, was her point. So then she ends by saying, I'm confused how teachers of Torah could not be Yahwists. And that's a great question. I have wondered about that, but here's my point, and it's just one slide. Let me read what I have. From the first to the last, in my opinion, Jesus' opponents in John's gospel are depicted as operating outside the Abrahamic family looking in. Now that's said carefully because, as I read on, since salvation is described by Jesus and Paul as being in Abraham, right? Like in Luke 19, Zacchaeus, salvation has come to your house because you are a son of Abraham. Or in Galatians 3:29, you're in Christ so that you can be in Abraham. The goal of the human project is to not be in Christ. It's to be in Abraham. Galatians 3:29. If you're in Christ, you're in Abraham. In other words, you get the Messiah, which puts you into the broader story because the Messiah is part of that story. So it stands to reason that these opponents were not, I don't believe, righteous. In other words, think of my whole point here, that if Jesus' opponent is, like in John the Baptist's understanding, less of a child of Abraham than that stone over there, God could make stones into the family of Abraham better than you, and Jesus agrees and Paul agrees, then it stands to reason that these opponents are not righteous. So now that's a troublesome idea. As Holly says, how could they be literally teaching Torah and worshiping another God? And I probably said this along the way, Mike, but here's on the slide, I'm going to read what I think is the best analogy. A similar situation likely exists today. We live in a Christian nation, one, quote, nation under God, capital G, but only a fraction, I hope a large fraction, but only a fraction are believers, right? Saved, or shall we say, in Abraham. So our corporate designation of being Christian may be similar to the problem of first century enemies of Jesus. They presumed to worship the correct deity. But here's where it sits, right? Each individual's choice of worship still had to be made on a daily basis. I cannot get around, so here's my opinion, I cannot get around Jesus' bold statement made various ways, many times in John, you are of your father, the devil. So to Holly's question, I'll agree. Again, I was taught Bible college, seminary, that Pharisees were wrong, probably because of pride and arrogance and maybe even, what's the word, hypocritical ideas. Pharisaical even means hypocritical in some dictionaries. So they were being hypocritical. But I was never taught that I remember by any of my teachers that they weren't Yahwists. And I have recommended that. And so Holly's on to me, right, and asking, how can that be? My answer quickly would be, well, we're not far from it today, where if you ask the average American, who do you worship? They would say, what do you mean? We're one nation under God. There's no choices here. Now, they probably don't know his name. Most people on the street don't know the name of the deity that we're talking about. But even if they did, notice that by being in a Christian nation and going to a Christian church and all that, it does not make you a believer. So I think we can have a lot of enemies of Jesus parading about as Yahwists in that day, not going to other temples, not even doing anything outwardly different than anyone else, but in their heart of hearts, somehow they were not in the family of Abraham, and thus they must have been doing something wrong. And here comes the, what causes you to be a believer or be a Christian in the Bible or be righteous. I would recommend worshiping the right deity, doing what that, giving your life to that deity and not another. So that's why I think they were not Yahwists, because they're children of the devil. So any other thoughts there?
I always took when you were saying that as a little bit more of a polemic delivery. It's like you're making a very pointed argument, right, of how if the Pharisees, if they were truly and righteously, loyally following after Yahweh, then when they met Yahweh on earth, they would have recognized him.
Right.
Like, at least that's how I would kind of view it. I keep thinking of the moment when Saul, or Paul later, gets knocked off his horse and he's hearing Jesus speak to him, but his first real question to him is, "Who are you, Lord?" Right. And he's a Pharisee of Pharisees, and yet he didn't recognize who Jesus was. And I think it's an interesting thing of how they thought that they were doing the right thing. They thought, and Saul thought, that he was doing something that was good for Yahweh. Mm-hmm. But in many ways, did not know him, did not know Yahweh at all.
Yeah. And just in case a person asks, well, what does it count to worship Yahweh? I get it out of Jeremiah, kind of an odd place to get it, but listen to how Jeremiah 8 verse 2 defines worship. Talking of people worshiping the wrong gods, they shall spread them before the sun, the moon, and all the host of heaven, which they have loved, after which they have served, after which they have walked, which they have sought, and which they have worshipped. So you have 5 words ending with worship, which seem to be synonymous. Love, serve, walk, seek. So if you can say, of these Pharisees in Jesus' day or the average American today, does a person love, serve, walk after, and seek the right God? I would argue that they're worshiping the right God. If those things fail, if they don't do that Monday through Saturday, don't count Sunday, don't worry about where they go to church. I'm talking about Monday through Saturday. That's what a worshiper of Yahweh is. So, again, praise the Lord, and I am a firm believer in this, Mike, that within every denomination, there are many believers. Again, by the way, this happened during our conversation this last week with Donnie's church that we visited out in Pennsylvania, and my wife was with me, and we had a wonderful 2.5 hours of talking with the church, about DCW things, question after question, so well thought through. How do you get saved? Became one of our questions, and I said, well, I probably used it here, but think of how simple it would be to be saved. A man's, you take a friend to a Franklin Graham crusade, and he hears the gospel, and he says, I want to go up there and get saved. And he, you back up and you let him by so he can go out into the stairway. As he heads down to the floor of the Colosseum, he trips and falls and dies halfway down. Now what? Does he get to heaven and God say, oh, sorry, yeah, you were almost there? And it was funny when I gave that sordid illustration. I knew this would happen. All the faces in the living room smiled because they knew the answer. No, he's in. So it shows that subconsciously we know that being in the family of Abraham, being a Christian, being a believer, whatever we want to call it now, is as simple as saying, I want it. Whatever it is, I want it. Mm-hmm. So now comes who's in, and then we think of all the denominational differences. And that's why I said, I think within each one, there are people who want it, right? Now, here's the problem. Within each one, there are people who don't care. So that's why the Pharisees could be, in Jesus' estimation, children of the devil. They could be going to tabernacle and temple and synagogue and be children of the devil because their hearts were not in it. So, all right, I'm ready for the last question. If you are, this is from Joey, and he gave a video, sent along a link to a video, and I watched it. It was very good. Here's his question. In listening to a video response of Gavin Ortlund to Dan McClellan, by the way, both names I'd recommend you be familiar with. Gavin Ortlund's he's got his own podcast. He's very good. Mm-hmm. Dan McClellan is a Mormon biblical scholar who is very textual. I mean, he really deals with Old Testament things in a very careful level. And I'd recommend, again, listening to him because don't not listen to the people you don't like. You can't do that. And he's going to have some good things to say on things that you need to hear, as well as some things you may not agree. But anyway, Dan McClellan is a good listen. So in listening to a video response of Gavin Ortlund to Dan McClellan, that's Gavin, recommends that Elohim in the Old Testament are either non-existent or to be understood simply as angels or demons. How should a DCW respond? Here is on the left just a snippet of the video. That's Dan McClellan there. That's not Gavin Ortlund. But the title, if you want to look it up, it's on YouTube. I would look up, Is Dan McClellan Right? No Monotheism in the Bible? ? That's how you can find the video by Gavin Ortlund. So then I grabbed another screenshot during his talk. McClellan believes there's no monotheism in the Bible, that you have Elohim and eventually Yahweh rising up through the ranks of Elohim in the Judahite or the Israelite theology. It's a slow progression. It's an evolution where Israel eventually comes to grab Yahweh as their Elohim, but the other Elohim certainly exist and even compete with Yahweh for supremacy. Gavin Ortlund decries that, and he says, no, there's only one God with a capital G, and I'm putting a word in his mouth there, but here is his argument or his summary that he then lands on. One of two things. Either these other gods are to be equated to foreign idols, in which case they are non-existent. And then you can use latter Isaiah 40 and on that have these idols being nothings. And there's many passages in the video that he cites. Or these Elohim of the Old Testament are spiritual powers, angels and demons. So quickly to summarize, or just give my opinion, and this, of course, we've talked about this many times, but to Joey's question, how should we respond to Gavin Ortlund's specific claim that either Elohim don't exist because they are equated with idols, or they do exist, but they only exist as angels or demons? How would we respond? How would I respond? Here's my opinion again, Mike. It doesn't have to be the answer of every DCWer, but it comes from my thoughts. Number one, the clarity of the biblical text. Elohim are presumed to exist by writers and Yahweh. So one of the things, and most of this is said, again, let's get McClellan off the stage. I'm talking about Gavin Ortlund now. Here's what I would say in response to his video, Gavin Ortlund's video, that the biblical text is clear that Elohim are presumed to exist. And so, and maybe he agrees with that as a statement without knowing where I'm going, though he may wonder, why do I bring it up? But I would just say, number one, and this is where Dr. Heiser was, this is where, of course, I've been talking for many years, and that is for 25 years since my dissertation on this, that when you read the Old Testament, every single page presumes their existence. So you've got to start with that. And if you're going to go to any kind of a non-existence, you're going to have a pretty heavy argument for that. Number two, the rhetoric of non-existence. Well, what do you do with that? There is a rhetoric of non-existence. The nations are nothings. The gods are nothings. The idols are nothings. Well, I would recommend that's always comparative. McClellan uses the poor example of the Denver Broncos versus the Oakland Raiders. He's a Denver Bronco fan, so he used the example of the Broncos are like God, capital G, and the Raiders are like the other Elohim. The problem with that is it's just not a good comparison, because you need to have a creator versus created comparison going on here, and that's not how the Raiders and the Broncos compare. So I would say that, and here's where you'd need to listen to Ortlund's argument and notice carefully where I think he underestimates the comparison language, the rhetoric comparisons of created Elohim to the nothings. He takes them to be non-existent because they're nothings, when I would recommend, no, this is a comparison issue. He then says, and this is again my third point, Elohim are just angels. Well, that's where I always challenge people. If you're going to say Elohim are angels, well, then angels are Elohim. We're right back to the same problem. So when a person says, well, I don't believe in Elohim, I believe in angels, I've got a list of 18 texts to take you to and say, okay, here's a place where this Elohim is called an angel 2 verses later, or this angel is called an Elohim 3 verses later. So that's where I think, again, just carelessness comes into play. I hate to use that term, but if you want to be really careful about your cosmology in the Old Testament, angels don't exist. Elohim do. And when an Elohim comes to deliver a message, it's going to be called a messenger. And that word messenger has unfortunately been transliterated into angelos, and now we get angel out of it. But that's a long argument, but I just find it to be, again, surprising that, well, it's not surprising, but okay, someone as good as Gavin Ortlund can just make that simple mistake. That's what I'm arguing against. Number 4, God's jealousy and anger makes sense because his competition is real. If God was mad at me for worshiping a figment of my imagination, I find that his anger would probably not be as bad. He'd be sad. He wouldn't be mad. But there is real anger in the Bible because we have real disloyalty. Idols, number 5, are easily described as different than the beings they represent. You get into this what is an idol story, which, again, I would recommend. It's much deeper than Gavin could have given in this video, that these idols are differing from the God, and they're also the same as the God. It depends on how you listen to the text. whatever it is, Paul's principalities and powers presumes authoritative and geographic rulers. If you say, I don't believe in gods, well, what are you going to do with Paul's principalities and powers? He does not call them angeloi. He calls them rulers of cosmic geography, if you want to narrow it down. And it really aligns very well with the Old Testament. So let's go to my last point. In the end, the purity of one's theology depends upon the purity of one's cosmology. I'm not frustrated by good theologians who make this mistake, but I am recommending, guys, until you get your cosmology right, you're not going to get your theology right. Because the cosmology of I'm God, not man, you're man, not God, that's the cosmology. You're either an anthropos or a theos. You're either a Adam or an Elohim. There is nothing in between. And so a spirit or ruach or, an angelos or a messenger. Yeah, a messenger what? That's always going to have to be your question. And it's only answered by having a good cosmology that gives you two options in the biblical model, and that is either man or God. Man or spirit. And so that's my quick answer to Dr. Ortland's summary. It's he's good on some things. I appreciate his challenge to Dan McClellan on some things. Again, the word monotheism is the question, and everyone, I agree, Ortland and McClellan all agree, and you would too, Mike, that monotheism is a 17th century term. And you can't take that term back into the Bible and really make much hay out of it, because it's just not. It's not a textual term, so you have to play with it a bit. But otherwise, I would recommend, like everything else, watch as you have time, good people talking about their differences of opinion, and that's my response to, on this case, Dr. Ortland. Any thoughts as we close?
I think you summed it up pretty well. I mean, I understood what Ortland was trying to get at when he said, either they're non-existent or they are just angels and demons. But it's also because, unfortunately, the way that our language, in many ways, we reduced even the post-Reformation kind of theology into a really stripped down version, where now it's either angels and demons. And we use that essentially interchangeably with the idea of they're spirits, they're divine powers, they're divine beings. And it is just recognizably, yes, it's a little sloppy, but I also understand what Ortland's trying to get at. I do think it just also still shows that there is a lot of baggage that it's really hard for a lot of Western theologians to unpack. That, what do you do with the word Elohim? Right. What do you do
it's as simple as that? What do you do?
When we've been taught that these gods that the Egyptian gods were never real, for example, or the Babylonian gods were never real, because of the word and the phrase of monotheism and the way that we have rigidly defined it, to also just essentially mean there's only one worship because there's only one God. And thus, because there's no other gods don't exist besides the God. When we are coming from that framework and we're not willing to go back to the text and notice that it's not following that framework, then we always keep hitting this kind of confusing set of arguments that essentially everyone's not using the same definitions when we're debating, right? Because we're not saying and making an agreement on when we use the word Elohim or when we use the word God, this is what we mean. Instead, we're all assuming what the word means, and we are assuming that the other person understands our definition as well.
Yeah, it comes back to, this was a conversation we had, with that little church that I went to, that you've got to unpack down to the level of taking the word God out of your Bible. I'm sorry, but you have to go to Elohim and Theos and take off the capital G, take off the capital TH. There are no capital gods in the Bible. We put them there out of respect. I mean, I know why we have it there, but they didn't have it. So just get in the habit. Get in the habit of pulling the capital letters off of everything, and then listen to the text define who that God is, the God of Israel, the God of Jacob, the God of Abraham. Why do they say of Abraham? Because they have to tell you which one. And until we get that And Pastor Donnie was very good with this, and he had been teaching his people this way, and a lot of them, they understood the value of reading your Bible that way. It's not hard to do it, but you got to make that move, and that's where I'd recommend even someone as good as Dr. Ortland to catch that you've got to get rid of the capital G. If you want to read it like them, you got to get rid of the capital G. I know in the pew today you want to capitalize it, but it's just not going to compute in the end otherwise. All right, Mike, I am done. Thank you so much. Again, we'll do one more period or one more episode of Q&A next time. And if you have questions, please send them in. Comments, questions. We love them. questions.dcwp@gmail.com. And until then, thank you, everyone, for listening, and we will talk to you next time. God bless.